Marcus, Lena, and Devon walked into the nightclub expecting nothing more than music, drinks, and laughter. But by the end of the night, two of them would be carried out on stretchers unconscious, and the third would be left asking how a celebration had turned into a carefully planned crime scene. The city pulsed with energy that night, a glow of neon reflecting off wet sidewalks as crowds of people lined up outside the most talked-about nightclub in town. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Strobes of light cut through thick waves of music, bass vibrating in the walls and floors. It was the kind of place that made people forget the outside world, a sealed pocket of sound and color where nothing else seemed to matter. The air was heavy with perfume, sweat, and the sharp tang of alcohol. Glasses clinked at the bar as bartenders moved with rehearsed precision, sliding cocktails across counters with quick flicks of the wrist. Every corner of the club was alive. At the heart of it all, the dance floor pulsed like a living organism. Strangers pressed together, moving to the beat in unison as if hypnotized. Shouts of excitement rose above the music, and laughter drifted through the crowd like smoke. For many, it was a night to celebrate. A promotion, a birthday, a reunion. For others, it was simply a chance to disappear into the anonymity of flashing lights. Nobody who walked into that club could have predicted what the night was going to become. Near the entrance, groups of friends posed for pictures, their phones capturing brief flashes of happiness before sliding them back into pockets and purses. On the upper floor, VIP lounges offered a different kind of energy. Couches lined with velvet, bottles of expensive liquor, and curtains drawn just enough to separate the elite from the masses below. From above, the view of the floor looked like chaos in motion, but for those down there, it was freedom. The DJ controlled the room, building tempo, breaking it down, then sending waves of sound crashing into the crowd again. Each track felt like fuel being poured onto a fire that was already roaring. Bouncers stood tall in the shadows, scanning the floor with practiced eyes. They'd seen almost everything in this club. Arguments, broken bottles, love affairs that burned bright and fizzled in the same night. But tonight felt different. Something in the air carried an edge, an undercurrent of tension invisible to most but impossible to ignore once noticed. Maybe it was the way some groups seemed to be watching one another too closely. Maybe it was the sheer number of people packed wall to wall, a pressure cooker of excitement and frustration, waiting for the smallest spark. As midnight neared, the crowd thickened even more. The line outside stretched halfway down the block, and inside there was barely room to breathe. Still, nobody wanted to leave. Every beat seemed to drive the room deeper into a frenzy. Every drink lowered inhibitions further. The celebration only grew louder, brighter, and more reckless. People believed they were safe in the bubble of noise and light, but safety was an illusion. Beneath the laughter, beneath the dancing, beneath the music that drowned out every thought, something darker was quietly taking root. The night was just beginning, and so was the danger. It began with something so small that most people barely noticed. Near the crowded bar, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor, the sound lost beneath the pounding music. A splash of liquid hit a man's shirt, and he turned sharply, glaring at the stranger beside him. The exchange of angry looks might have ended there, but alcohol burned through reason, and the tension snapped quickly. A shove sent one man stumbling back into a group of dancers who shouted in protest as drinks spilled and elbows flew. Suddenly, a chain reaction spread outward like ripples in water, pulling others into a storm they hadn't chosen. The flashing lights and pulsing bass masked the seriousness of the moment. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a drunken quarrel, the kind that bouncers broke up every weekend. Yet this time, the mood shifted faster than anyone expected. Raised voices carried across the dance floor, and bodies began colliding as tempers flared. Security moved in, but the sheer density of the crowd made it nearly impossible to reach the center of the chaos. People pushed back against one another, confused and angry, caught between wanting to escape and refusing to back down. In the upper lounge, onlookers leaned over the railing, their excitement turning to unease as they watched the energy below twist into something dangerous. The once hypnotic rhythm of the music no longer unified the crowd. Instead, it amplified their aggression. The pounding bass felt more like a war drum than an invitation to dance. Broken bottles glinted on the floor, sharp reminders of how quickly fun had transformed into violence. By now, the fight was no longer between two men. Strangers, already fueled by alcohol and adrenaline, took sides without knowing why. Some joined simply because they had been shoved or splashed, others because the frenzy made it impossible to stand still. The crowd became a storm of fists, shouts, and overturned tables. What had been a celebration just minutes earlier now resembled a battlefield in strobe-lit fragments. The bouncers tried to restore control, their heavy frames forcing paths through the writhing crowd, but every effort was swallowed up by fresh bursts of anger. For every person pulled away, two more seemed to jump in. The heat in the room grew unbearable, a mix of sweat and panic choking the air. Some people scrambled to escape, pressing toward the exits, but the sheer crush of bodies made leaving feel impossible. Fear began to replace excitement, yet many were still too intoxicated or enraged to see how quickly things were spiraling. As the brawl grew, it seemed to feed on itself. People who had nothing to do with the original spark found themselves trapped in the middle, their survival instincts pushing them into the chaos. In those moments, the nightclub lost its identity as a place of music and lights. It became something raw and uncontrolled, an arena where order had vanished and violence ruled. No one could have guessed that this sudden explosion of fury was not only dangerous, but a cover for something far more sinister that no one yet understood. The violence swelled until it felt unstoppable, but then something strange shifted in the middle of the chaos. People were still pushing, still throwing punches, still shouting over the deafening music, but scattered among them were bodies beginning to fall. At first, it seemed as though some had been knocked out from the fight. One man slumped forward, his glass slipping from his hand as he crumpled to the floor. A woman nearby tried to scream, but instead she collapsed beside him, her legs buckling as if her strength had suddenly been stolen away. The floor, already slick with spilled drinks, became a graveyard of motionless figures. The sudden collapses went unnoticed at first. The flashing strobe lights painted the scene in disjointed fragments, making it difficult to distinguish between those who had been injured in the fight and those who were falling for another reason entirely. But as more bodies dropped, panic began to spread through the crowd. A circle of confusion opened up around the unconscious, though not wide enough to keep others from stumbling over them. Shouts of alarm started to rise above the thundering music, and even the most aggressive fighters began to hesitate, their rage cracking under a new, more primal fear. The DJ cut the music abruptly, and the silence that followed was pierced by screams. In the harsh glare of the emergency lights, the scale of what had happened became impossible to ignore. Dozens of people were on the floor, unmoving, their bodies scattered in every direction. Some twitched weakly, others lay completely still, their faces pale beneath the club's harsh lighting. A thick wave of panic crashed over the room. People scrambled toward the exits, clawing their way through the crowd in desperate attempts to escape. The club staff rushed to respond, but the scene was overwhelming. Bartenders abandoned their stations, trying to reach the fallen, while bouncers shouted commands that were quickly drowned out by the hysteria. A few tried to lift the unconscious out of the crush, but the narrow passages and sheer density of terrified bodies made every step a battle. Shoes pounded against the floor, glass shattered underfoot, and the once contained fight dissolved into something far more terrifying: mass chaos fueled by fear. On the ground, the victims showed no obvious signs of injury, no bruises, no cuts, no broken bones that could explain their sudden collapse. Their shallow breathing and glazed expressions told a different story, one that none of the witnesses could understand in the moment. To many, it felt as if the nightclub itself had turned poisonous, as though the air they breathed or the drinks they consumed had suddenly become weapons. The emergency services were finally called, sirens wailing in the distance as the scene inside grew more frantic. Some tried to help the fallen, pressing their fingers against pulses or shaking shoulders desperately, but their efforts seemed useless. Others tripped and fell as they tried to escape, the fear of joining the unconscious driving them forward. The night that had started with music and laughter had become something unrecognizable. The dance floor was no longer a place of freedom. It was now a place where people were collapsing for reasons no one could yet explain. Paramedics rushed through the front doors, their equipment bags clutched tightly as police officers forced a path through the panicked crowd. The flashing red and blue lights outside painted the club in a sickening glow, a reminder that whatever had happened was beyond anything the staff could handle alone. Emergency responders expected to treat bruises, cuts, and maybe head injuries from the fight, but the scene that greeted them was far stranger. Victims lay sprawled on the floor with glass scattered around them, but their injuries did not match the violence of the brawl. Their breathing was shallow, their skin clammy, and their eyes rolled back as though they had been drained of all strength. The chaotic fight was quickly overshadowed by a disturbing realization. Something else had been happening inside the club, hidden beneath the noise and flashing lights. Police officers moved quickly, sealing the exits and holding back the uninjured patrons who were desperate to flee. Witnesses were told to stay put, their frightened faces illuminated by the harsh glow of overhead lights. Some shouted in protest, but their voices were drowned out by the cries of those kneeling over friends and loved ones who refused to wake. The scene was no longer just a nightclub dispute. It had turned into a potential crime scene on a massive scale. Investigators knew they had to act fast before critical evidence disappeared. Security staff directed detectives to the camera room, where dozens of screens displayed fragmented views of the club. Hours of footage had to be reviewed, but one section immediately caught attention. Before the fight even began, a lone figure could be seen weaving through the crowd with unsettling purpose. They did not dance, did not linger in conversation, and seemed to avoid notice entirely. Instead, the person moved carefully between groups, pausing briefly at tables where drinks sat unattended. A faint glint suggested something small being dropped into glasses before the stranger blended back into the swarm of bodies. The timeline was chilling. The figure's movements occurred minutes before the fight erupted, as though they had anticipated the distraction. The possibility that the brawl was staged began to harden into certainty. Witness statements revealed how quickly the argument near the bar had escalated, spreading almost unnaturally fast. Some described the first shoves as deliberate, too aggressive for an accident, as if someone had wanted to ignite a riot. If the fight had been engineered, it was a perfect cover for the real crime. While fists flew and chaos reigned, someone had quietly poisoned the room. Forensics teams began collecting abandoned drinks, shattered glass, and swabs from sticky puddles on the floor. Each sample was carefully sealed, the contents unknown but suspected to hold answers. The victims who had collapsed were rushed out on stretchers, their faces eerily alike in their lifeless stillness. Reporters gathered outside the club, shouting questions into the night, while police refused to release details. Inside, the grim truth was forming. This was not a random outbreak of violence. It was a calculated act, carried out in plain sight, and the one responsible had vanished before anyone realized what was happening. The toxicology reports arrived days later, and they revealed the horrifying truth that investigators had already begun to suspect. The victims had not been knocked unconscious by the brawl. Instead, they had been poisoned with a combination of fast-acting chemicals designed to overwhelm the nervous system. It was a mixture so precise and unusual that specialists believed it had been created for the sole purpose of incapacitation, not death. The victims had survived, but doctors warned that a slightly higher dosage could have easily turned the nightclub into a mass grave. This chilling detail raised a disturbing question. Why had someone gone to such lengths to bring down dozens of people at once? Police traced every second of the figure's movement on the security footage, but the trail was maddeningly incomplete. The individual wore a hood that obscured their face, and while the cameras caught glimpses of their hands slipping near unattended drinks, there was nothing clear enough to identify them. Witnesses remembered almost nothing about the figure, their memories blurred by alcohol and the confusion of the fight. Some claimed the person might have left through a side exit moments before security shut the doors, while others swore they saw no one at all. The absence of answers only deepened the fear. As the investigation widened, detectives began to consider the possibility that the fight had not only been a cover, but also a test. If the person responsible had wanted to cause permanent harm, they could have done so. Instead, they seemed to be studying the effects of their concoction, using a nightclub filled with unsuspecting strangers as their laboratory. This was not an act of rage or revenge. It was a carefully planned experiment carried out on human lives. The nightclub itself never recovered. The owners closed the doors permanently, unwilling to let the place be remembered for anything other than that night of terror. The building remained empty, its dark windows a reminder of the horror that had unfolded within. People avoided even walking past it, whispering about the victims who had collapsed in the flashing lights, their bodies scattered like fallen dancers across the floor. Rumors spread quickly, some insisting the attack had ties to organized crime, others whispering that it was the work of someone preparing for something much larger. Authorities released no official suspect, and no arrest was ever made. The case went cold, but it never faded from memory. For those who had been there, the memory of bodies dropping without warning was something that haunted their dreams. Survivors described the sensation of helplessness, of realizing that safety was an illusion and that danger could be disguised as just another night out. The unanswered questions became the most haunting part. Who was the figure that moved so silently through the crowd? Why had they chosen that club, that night, and those people? And most terrifying of all, would they strike again somewhere else, perfecting the act they had already tested so successfully?